ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ, ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ. Welcome to the segment of Khoj Gurbani's a-sabad-a-day, the recitation for the day. Gauri Mahalla Nama Sadho Raam Saran Bisrama Ved Puran Pade ko eh gun Simre har ko nama रहाओ. लोभ मोह माया ममता फुन औ बिखयन की सेवा. हरख सोग परसै जह नाहिन सो मूरत है देवा. सुरग नरक अमृत बिख ए सब त्यो कंचन अर पैसा. उस्तत निंदा ए समझा कैं लोभ मोह फुन तैसा. दुख सुख ए बाधे जे नाहिन तह तुम जानो ज्ञानी. नानक मुक्त ताहे तुम मानो एह बिद जो को जो प्राणी. दुख सुख ए बाधे जह नाहिन तह तुम जानो ज्ञानी. नानक मुक्त ताहे तुम मानो एह बिद को जो प्राणी. Guru Tegh Bahadur, the author of this passage, is continuing the theme that he began a few passages earlier, namely on the obstinate nature of the mind that refuses to self-reflect. In other words, that refuses to rise above its ordinary day-to-day experience, which is binding, which keeps it in bondage, that tosses it about, that makes it unhappy, noxious, narcissistic. Despite the fact that we may be reading sacred texts, in the previous passage he had said, Ved Puran sad mag sunkar, Ved Puran sad mag sunkar, nimak na har gun gave. So, having heard the Veds, the sacred texts, Purans, Sad Mag, the way of the seeker, Sunkar, having heard, despite that, Nimaknahar Gun Gave, does not turn to self-reflection. Gun Gave, creation of virtue, which is what is intended. So that theme continues in this short passage. He begins in the Rahau Pankti, Sadho, again addressing seekers, devotees, those on the path. Raam Saran Bisrama, tranquility, peace, repose, however you want to address Bisrama, is to be found in the sanctuary of the self. And that sanctuary is within. Ved Puran Pade ko eh gun, the virtue of studying sacred texts, the scriptures, is this, he says, eh. Simre har ko nama, that in reading and studying the sacred texts, that we may reflect on self-knowledge. The purpose of reading scripture is to motivate the mind to read the scripture of the mind, or self-reflection. Guru Amar Das in one place says, Man ki patri vachiye pai. It's the page of the mind that you have to read. And that motivation comes from reading scripture. So this passage is a cautionary note for all of us who dutifully recite their daily Nitnem without ever transitioning to self-reflection. And then what happens is that name becomes a mindless habit. It's reduced to just a daily grind that you do out of habit, like having a cup of coffee. It's mindless because you have not read it carefully, because if you did with attention, it's telling you to go within. It's telling you to read the mind, but that you have not done. So you see the problem. Now the Guru comes to the state of the natural mind. First, he goes and then he describes the state of one who arises above these attachments. Lobh, moh, maya, mamata, fune aur bikhin ki seva. Harak sog parsay jay nahin. So murat hai deva. Such a being is the shining embodiment of the Creator, a deva, an evolved individual. Who is such a being? Who, by discarding attachment to the ego self, maya mamata, and in so doing, finds freedom from the mind's tendency for greed, for toxic pleasures, and who then becomes untouched by the vicissitudes of life. Harg sog par se nahi. Such a being is the shining embodiment of the Creator. You see, the point being made is that Bisrama, peace, tranquility, is our natural state, to be state. That is the state to be in. Ego, how may, along with its qualities like lobh, moh, these are qualities of the ego. They arise with the ego. Greed, attachment, desire. This is our default state. This is our given state. And in the given state, how may ego is in a constant cycle of desire, of attachment, of greed, lobh, moh, maya, mamata. This cycle gives further rise to the cycle of happiness and sorrow, depending on your experience, right? So you are in this constant churn of the mind, which as a byproduct gives rise to a toxic neurosis, narcissism, because there's always the desire to want more, the desire to seek happiness and be averse to pain, and so on. So the Guru is saying that if you can experience all of this with equanimity, without getting attached to it, then you have evolved to a deva. Such, so murat hai deva. And that is our to-be state. That is where we have to go. And he continues to give examples of how to live with equanimity. He says, Surag narg amrit bekh, heaven and hell, comfort and discomfort, kanchan aur paisa, gold and copper, ustat ninda, praise and censure. If this is treated alike, samajake, without greed and attachment, lobh moh funatasa, then furthermore, dukh sukh a-sabad-a-day nahin. You remember that cycle of sorrow and pleasure that arises? You're freed from that as well. If this is how, then, says Nanak, mukt tahe tum mano. Such a person knows the way, is free. And tahe tum jano gyani. He's possessed or she is possessed of self-knowledge. So we have to read scripture in order to turn to self-reflection and use the scripture as guide to go within the depths of our own being. And there is the sanctuary of the self, which is peace, tranquility, equipoise, sahaj. it is from that perspective that you want to be the host within the body and experience life without becoming narcissistic about it. On that note, Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.